Hi, and good morning, everybody. I hope you're all doing well out there. Thank you for joining us today and for registering for today's webinar. My name is Rachel Warren. I'm the manager of the Ombudsperson's consultation and training team, and I'll be moderating today's session. We have a large number of participants today, so we're going to be using the webinar format, which allows you to pose questions throughout the webinar that we will be able to address throughout the webinar, but we'll also have some time at the end for some questions, question and answer periods. So we'll also provide you with our contact information at the end of the session if there's anything that you want to raise with us afterwards. So with that, I would like to just begin by introducing Jay Chalk, BC's ombudsperson, and then I will be back at the end of the session to join Jay in answering some of your questions.
Thank you, Rachel. Greetings and welcome to the Office of the Ombudsperson's Complaining 101, intended to help you be more effective at getting results when you have a problem with a public authority in British Columbia. With the assistance of other staff at our office, we're going to share some tips that we've learned from experience to be effective at resolving complaints about public services here in BC. We'll hear from Lindsay Hunt, who's our education specialist, and we hope you find the practical tips that we're going to share with you today helpful in raising and resolving concerns that you have about public services. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge with respect that we're presenting today from our office in Victoria, which is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, including the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And we recognize them and their ancestors for their stewardship of these lands. And I invite you to also take a moment to reflect on the territory you're joining us from today. I'd also like to thank you for taking time out of your no doubt busy schedules to be with us. We know how frustrating it can be to spend time trying to resolve concerns at the best of times. And so from the helpful comments that we've received from the registration, it appears that many of you already know about our office and how we operate, and that's great. And for those of you who aren't so familiar with us, don't worry. This session is about helping you to address your concerns on your own, but we will talk a little bit about how we can help later. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we can help with complaints you might have had about public organizations. And we speak from experience as my office has been responding to complaints from the public for over 40 years now. Over those 4 decades, more than 400,000 complaints and inquiries have come to us. During that time, not only have we developed an expertise in how to handle complaints, but we've also seen firsthand what works and what doesn't when it comes to the public making their own effort to resolve their complaints. And even with all this experience, I'm sure that there are new complaints that we've not yet heard. So I can tell you from my own experience that whenever I thought I'd heard it all, I was always surprised by a new twist that has not come up before. Although our experience is mostly with public service organizations, the tips and tools that we're going to share with you today can help with complaints about other types of organizations, some of whom have their own ombudsperson's offices, like the CBC or chartered banks or Canada Post. These exist, in truth, because complaints help organizations get better. Many of the practices we will be sharing are the same ones that our own investigators use when they set out to investigate a specific complaint. Before we get into today's content, I want to just acknowledge the time we're in right now. It's very stressful, and governments have been challenged to exercise a great deal of authority in response to the current pandemic. And the challenges associated with COVID-19 are experienced differently by different people, depending on a whole host of factors. And we're certainly seeing complaints come to our office from people who are being impacted by changes to the health system or restrictions or changes to government services during that pandemic. Many public servants, for example, working from home, and so serving the public differently. And some of those are the sorts of things that we may be able to help with. But we also know that some 18 months into the pandemic that people are pretty tired and frustrated. And while many of them are coming to us with their concerns, we may not investigate if they relate to broader public health measures that are necessary for any government during the pandemic. I will tell you a little bit more about our specific role a little later in the webinar. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to turn the webinar over to Lindsay, who will kick things off with talking about what complaints are all about and to provide some complaining 101 tips. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, yes, good morning to everyone. My name is Lindsay and I'm with the Office of the Ombudsperson, and I really, thank you so much for joining us today. The webinar today will last about an hour, and throughout that hour, we're going to have a chance to hear what some of the most common problems are that you face when raising your complaints. And we're going to also offer some tips about how to frame your complaints in a way that is both productive and results oriented. We're also going to give you some information about where you can take complaints about public organizations and tell you more about where our office specifically fits in to that question. So we'll have about 40 minutes of presentation time to walk you through our tips, and then we'll have some time at the end for Jay to field some questions. So before we jump into the tips, let's go over a few Zoom housekeeping items to start. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Zoom, but just to let you know what functions we're using today. As Rachel mentioned at the beginning, you can ask questions at any time through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar. And you can click on that and type in a question about the webinar's content. And we have folks who will be responding right away, just typing responses to you. Some of the questions may be saved until the end of the webinar, where we will have that Q&A session where Rachel and Jay will be back at answering some of those questions. And just a couple things about that Q&A function. You can send your questions anonymously, so there's that option. And while we will try to answer everyone's questions, we might not be able to get to everyone's questions. And in that case, you can email us directly afterwards and we'll respond. We'll provide the email address at the end of the session for you to jot down. The chat function, as we go through the presentation, we're going to post a couple links that hopefully will be of interest to you in that chat box. So just keep an eye on that. There are also automated closed captions. So if you want those, you can click on the CC button, or you can turn them off by also clicking that CC button. And then lastly, we will be using the polling feature in today's webinar. All poll responses are 100% anonymous, but also please note that if you're joining the webinar using the web browser, you may not be able to see the polls, but I will read them out and I'll read out the answers as well. So let's get started with a quick poll just to introduce that feature. We're going to launch that first poll, and there's 2 questions on this poll. So if you answer the first one and then the second one and scroll down and then click submit. So the first question, have you ever raised a complaint to an organization or business? So there's yes, no, or maybe I can't recall. And then the second question, how do you feel about the idea of raising a complaint to an organization or business? And there's very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, not comfortable, and I don't think it's the news. So we'll just wait a moment or two to gather some of those responses before we share it back out with everyone. Great, we've got them coming in. Looks like, yeah, let's share those back out so people can see what the responses are. So we've got a large number of folks. Yes, you have complained. A few no's. There's varied kind of amounts of comfort. More people are comfortable doing that, with a few folks who are somewhat or not comfortable at all with it. So we hope that the tips that we provide today will build that confidence and give you some tools to use. Okay, we'll just close that off. So why are we here today? I'd like to invite you to take a moment to think about how many times you complain in a day. Is it once or twice? Perhaps it's a little more than that. Just take a moment and think of how many times do you actually complain? Well, research actually shows that the average person complains between 15 to 30 times a day. And sometimes it's something that we do very consciously, and sometimes it's something that we really don't think about. And it can be about so many different things, perhaps about service that we've received, the traffic that we're experiencing, how our kids or families are behaving or what they're doing, our jobs. The list really can actually go on and on. And often when we reflect back on those times that we have complained, we can be left with lingering negative feelings such as frustration, anger, or lack of, feeling empowered. And today our complaining tips are going to really focus on the world that we deal with at the Ombudsperson's office. So that's complaints about services and programs offered by local and provincial public sector organizations. And what I mean by that, I mean organizations such as local or provincial governments, public schools or universities, hospitals and health authorities, and crown corporations such as ICBC and BC Hydro, just to name a few. So that's the context in which we're talking about complaining today. Let's clarify what exactly we mean by the word complaints for the purpose of today's session. So if you actually look in the dictionary, generally a complaint is defined as an expression of dissatisfaction. Well, we go a little bit further than that in our office and within the context of today's webinar, and we define a complaint as an expression of dissatisfaction about a public organization's programs, services, or people where a response is expected, which is really what we're focusing on here today. So a complaint typically involves looking for a solution and should be a means to an end. It's really about solving a problem. And complaints may seem like a nuisance to some or even negative, but when we're training staff with public organizations, we really do like to highlight the positive aspect of complaints. We speak to their importance. It's free feedback that can lead to improvements in service delivery. And often one complaint can really represent the voice of many. And when done effectively and acted on properly by public organizations, complaints are really a win-win for everyone involved. So for the public, the complaint has led to an action, perhaps an apology or a change in a process. And then for the organization, they've heard the feedback and hopefully have made changes to prevent further complaints. So within the context of today as well, it's important to remember that there are some things that complaints are not. A complaint isn't just venting or ruminating about things that impact us, such as traffic or something that your spouse or partner or friend has done. And importantly, a complaint shouldn't always be seen as something negative. When done correctly, a complaint is actually a chance for your voice to be heard and to hopefully make change happen. So when we're talking about complaints about public sector organizations, what kinds of things are we talking about exactly? I'm going to put a few examples up here and just name a few of them. You might be needing services and having a hard time accessing them. Maybe it's in relation to income or disability assistance or another type of benefit provided by government. Maybe you've raised a concern with an organization and nobody is getting back to you, or you don't understand the information that you've been given. Maybe you just don't think an organization's following their own rules or policies. Or maybe you feel a decision that's been made is unfair. Say a decision about a parking ticket, you feel you were issued in error. Or you might be concerned a decision was made without notifying you, or that you weren't given an understandable explanation of the reasons for a decision that impacts you. So there's obviously, lots of other situations that you might find yourself in relation to complaints about public organizations. And these are just a few of those examples. And before we move forward, let's actually take another poll to see what types of challenges you've maybe experienced or that you may anticipate experiencing when raising a complaint. So that's now up on the screen. Some common challenges that you've either experienced or that you might anticipate experiencing. So if you want to fill in your answers there. So what are the most common challenges? So I can't find information about how to complain. I can't get a real, quote unquote, real person to raise my complaint to. I raise a complaint, but it takes too long. I don't feel listened to. Too many bureaucratic hoops. An organization doesn't explain what will happen next. Or I never hear back. So I just don't know the outcome of my complaint, or nothing has happened as a result. And then the last option is all of the above. So we've got number of options there for folks to fill in. And it's multiple choice, so you can put as many in there as you like. We'll give it another moment or two as those answers come in before we share it back out so folks can see. All right, let's share that back out now so folks can take a look. So really quite, varied. With the most landing in there are too many bureaucratic hoops to go through to get my voice heard. We've got close second here with the organization doesn't explain what will happen next. And then, I can't get a real person to raise my complaint to. So lots of frustrations, clearly. And a few folks have said all of the above. So lots, definitely experiencing lots of challenges. Thank you so much for popping your answers in there so we can really understand what folks are experiencing. So we know that there are reasons clearly that hold people back. We saw that in the poll. So let's briefly review a few of those reasons as to why we maybe don't pick up that phone or write that complaint. So first, we might not know who to call. And a common problem we see is that people just have no idea where to take their complaints. We might feel like it takes just too much time and energy. It's another thing that we need to do. And there may also be cultural language or other barriers that make bringing concerns forward challenging. We might be worried that there could be negative consequences to us or to the services that we receive if we complain. Or we might worry about how complaining may impact our relationship with that organization or the staff. And then finally, we might think that our complaint just won't fix a problem or have any impact. There's lots of challenges and concerns around raising complaints. But what are some of those reasons that we do complain? What still motivates us, though, to bring that concern forward? When we do bring a complaint forward, usually we want something tangible to happen. It might be that we want better service. It might be that we want a decision reversed, or perhaps a better explanation of a decision that was made. It might be that we want a refund or a reimbursement of money that's owed to us. It might be that we want an apology. And many times people raise their complaints because they don't want what happened to them to happen to anyone else. As I mentioned, many complaints are brought forward because people want to ensure that that same issue isn't experienced by others. And this can have a lot of power, not only for the individual, but for the system as a whole. So complaints, again, they often have a lot of power, and the changes made as a result of a single complaint can actually end up making a difference for many. We tell public sector organizations that one complaint often represents the voice of many others, and therefore it's critical to take them seriously and to make changes when change is required. So here are a couple examples of one complaint that actually ended up impacting many people, and I'll just read these out. A woman came to our office raising a complaint about visitor restrictions in long-term care. That complaint led us to investigate, and as a result, the government committed to making several aspects of the essential visitor policy more fair, including giving better explanations to people about decisions and making information to the public more clear and consistent. And then in another example, someone on income assistance came to our office with a complaint about a miscalculation of benefits, which resulted in the government committing to repaying almost $1 million back in benefits to folks. So in 40 years of dealing with complaints, we see the difference that a single complaint can make. So think about this the next time you make a complaint. Remember that complaints are they're catalysts for both small change for you as an individual and possibly big change as well. So now that we've talked about what complaints are all about, let's actually move forward and discuss what some of those tips are about making an effective complaint. As we kind of move into this section, I invite you to take a moment to think about some tips that perhaps you have learned in the past. What has worked for you over the years? And I'm sure you have many, and some may be very similar to the tips that I'm going to share with you here today. So basically what we're covering here today are 5 key tips that we'd like to share. And These are to help you make an effective complaint and hopefully get the results that you're looking for. I'm going to just briefly introduce them right now, and then we're going to go into more detail on each of those 5 just following this. So briefly here. Number 1, define the problem and how you think it should be resolved. Think about the solution or outcome that you're seeking. Second tip, do your research about the complaint process. The third, share your complaint and ask for a response. Fourth tip, keep notes and records throughout the complaint process. And then the last tip, ask about further appeal options available to you. So those are the 5 tips that we're going to be going through. And I'm going to go into more detail right now. So let's hop into that first tip right away. So tip number 1, define the problem and be clear on what needs to be done to fix it. So first of all, it's important to do that, defining the problem. What does this mean though? Well, often there are several issues that you'd like to complain about. Perhaps someone was rude to you or hung up on you, or maybe you didn't feel like you were being listened to, and your concern is being largely ignored. So defining the problem is about trying to stay focused on that key concern itself and not a long laundry list of issues that you've experienced. And we find that it really helps to actually ask yourself 5 questions and jot down the answers before you make your complaint. So think about the 5 W's. So what happened? Where did it happen? When? Who was involved? And why? Why do you think you were treated unfairly, or that the service or decision you received was unacceptable or unsatisfactory? So focusing clearly on exactly what happened and why you're dissatisfied is a very, very important piece of it, as is being clear on the outcome that you're seeking. So in doing so, think about how do you see your complaint being resolved? And what are some of the possible solutions or outcomes you see that would address your concerns? So it's important to think about what solution you see to the problem and let that organization know so they can give you information about whether the resolution you're seeking is actually something within that organization's power to do. And the more specific you can be, the better. So try to keep things short and as to the point as possible. And of course, just trying to kind of think through it and staying calm. And while that can be hard at times, the benefits definitely, outweigh the drawbacks for sure. So after you've outlined those 5 W's, it's now time to do your research. So tip 2, doing your research. And what does that mean? It means finding out about the organization's complaints process. And most public organizations do have a process for handling complaints. And that process should be accessible and easy for you to understand as members of the public. So for example, there should be multiple ways to raise a complaint, whether that be by phone or email or an online complaint form. You shouldn't be asked to have your complaint in writing. There should also be staff available to you to explain the complaints process verbally to you. And you should have the right to have an advocate or representative make a complaint with you or for you if needed. It's also important to know exactly who is the best person to speak to about your complaint. So ask to speak to that person directly. And often the person that you're already dealing with may be the best person to resolve your complaint, as they have knowledge of your situation and may be able to take quick steps to fix a problem. And in other cases, it may be someone else in the organization, or there may be a complaints handling department specifically that you can be transferred to. But the focus really should be on the person best positioned to help resolve your concerns. And tip number 3, sharing your complaint and asking for a response. And we know that resolving complaints early is really a win-win, both for an organization and for the public. And many organizations, they have trained staff, as we do at our office, whose job it is to resolve complaints early. So the first step to quick resolution is to share your complaint with the organization as clearly and concisely as possible. So thinking back to those 5 W's in tip number 1, this is really about making sure that you clearly outlined what your concerns are and what you are hoping for when it comes to a resolution. Include information about what you've already done to try to sort things out. You may also find it helpful to include copies of previous letters or photos or statements, that documentation. And don't forget that if your problem is urgent, say so and explain why. Many organizations will flag urgent issues and ensure that they're handled in a timely manner. And I know that any complaint that you might have feels urgent, but most organizations, they do have specific criteria that they use to determine whether a complaint should be prioritized as urgent. So for example, in our office, we prioritize complaints that raise health or safety concerns for the person or their children, or where the person reports an urgent need for things like food, shelter, healthcare, or income security. And so these issues that require immediate attention by the organization. So if there is some urgency to your complaint, let them know. And then lastly here, when you raise a concern, it's really important to clearly indicate that you would like a response from the organization so that they know that you're wanting them to take steps to look into and to respond to your concerns. And it's useful to also ask about timelines, ask how long it will take even generally to respond to your complaint. And depending on the circumstances, you may want to ask for the response to your complaint in writing. Even a quick email from the organization that outlines that they received your complaint and what their response is works great. So this may or may not be possible for the organization, but asking for it means that you're actually more likely to get it. And having this record can be very beneficial, particularly if you don't get the result that you're ultimately looking for. All right, moving into tip 4, keeping notes and records. And it may seem like an extra step, but in our experience, keeping notes and correspondence when you're involved in raising a complaint is really important. So this means writing down the names, positions, and phone numbers of people you have contacted about your complaint, as well as the date of that contact. So writing that down and writing down what was being said as well. And these notes can really help to serve as an important record of your complaint that you might actually need later if you're facing challenges getting the resolution that you're looking for. Now, once you do get a response from the organization, and if it isn't what you wanted, it is important to take a look at that response and the issue objectively. For example, taking a moment and asking yourself, is what I'm hoping for actually realistic under the circumstances? So taking that time to consider the issue and the response that you received is an important step before moving forward. And then moving into tip number 5, it's important to remember that at the end of the process, if you are still dissatisfied and you feel like your complaint wasn't addressed, and objectively speaking, it could still reasonably be addressed, there are often other avenues you can take through appeals or review processes. So again, check public information or loop back with the organization to find out what appeal avenues might be available to you. And remember that these avenues often have specific deadlines and criteria. Also, if you're going to go the appeal route, it's important to explain clearly why you think the original decision was wrong or unfair in the first place. Being clear on that is helpful. So we've gone through those 5 tips. Now, what's next? How do we put it all together? What do you say? And is there a specific way to say it? How do we put it together? Well, we're going to go through a tip here, and this is from a US psychologist and author, Guy Winch. And Guy recommends using the complaint sandwich approach to resolving concerns. And that the idea is to lead with a positive statement, then focus on the substance or the main issue of your complaint, and then close that sandwich with a call to action, or specifically what that action is that you want to see as a result. I'm sure many of you have heard of this, but we're going to go into it in a little bit more detail. So that first slice of bread is your opener. That's that positive statement. So this slice of bread is to make the listener more sympathetic to your complaint. And starting with that positive statement can help put you both at ease. So you're being respectful and acknowledging something positive about the organization's programs or services, which can then help that person on the other end, be in more of a positive frame of mind. And then the next is that substance of the sandwich. And this is the complaint itself and the suggested outcome that you want. Try not to include several complaints in one. Remember to be specific, define the problem and outline it really clearly. And we suggest this being that primary issue that you want the organization to address. And then this final slice of bread is that call to action to motivate the organization to do something. So in action, here's what it might look like. Let's think about that complaint about the parking ticket that was issued by mistake. So in the email or on the phone, I could say, hi there. I know you're really busy and I appreciate all that you do for the city. And I really appreciate the efforts of you and your staff to deal with parking issues. So this is that positive statement, that first slice of bread. However, I seem to have been issued an incorrect parking ticket. I parked at meter 60 and paid $6 for 2 hours of parking. When I returned to my car an hour and a half later, I found a parking ticket on my window. I noticed the ticket is for a different meter. I've taken a few images of my car parked at the meter as well as of the ticket that I'm happy to share with you. So that's that middle part, the substance, that's your complaint. It's specific. I'd really appreciate it if you could help me out by reviewing my information, as I think it shows the ticket was issued in error. I would ask that the ticket be canceled. Please get back to me and let me know the result of your review. So that's that call to action, what you're expecting in return. And it sounds pretty basic, I know, but sometimes the most basic approaches or tips can actually be the most effective ones. So reflect on perhaps the situation that you've had today or this week, a complaint maybe that you've had, and think about how you could actually use this approach to frame that concern or your complaint. So after you've taken all of these steps, what then should you actually expect from an organization that you're complaining to? And here are a few things that you should expect from them. You should be responded to promptly. You should feel listened to and feel like your complaint is understood, including the outcome that you seek. You should understand what their complaint process is, as well as the next steps or what you can expect with your complaint. You should be treated with dignity and respect. You may receive an apology, and you should also receive clear and meaningful reasons for a decision that you understand. And recently we released a complaint handling guide for public sector organizations, which we're going to share with you in the chat right now, a link to it. It's found on our website. And you might want to look over what some of those best practices are for organizations when it comes to handling complaints. This can help you hold an organization accountable. So we've gone over our 5 key tips, as well as what you should expect when you actually raise a complaint. But what happens if that complaint isn't actually going anywhere? What's next? And if your complaint or concern still remain unresolved, that's actually where our office fits in. So I'm going to now hand it back over to Jay, who's going to share one last bonus tip with you. Hi, Jay.
Hi, Lindsay. Thanks very much. And hi again, everyone. Glad to see you're still with us. Before we get into tip number 6, I want to just do a quick, another quick poll. So before this webinar, how aware and familiar were you with the BC Office of the Ombudsperson? Haven't heard of it before. I've heard the name, but not at all familiar. I'm aware, but not very familiar. I'm aware, somewhat familiar, or aware and very familiar. Quick fact, a few quick facts about us again while you're answering the poll. We've been around 40 years. About 400,000 people over those years have turned to us for help. And our services cost each British Columbian about the price of a Tim Hortons medium sized coffee every year. So let's end the poll and take a quick look at the results. So everybody's heard of us a little bit, but a number of you are heard the name but not too familiar. But it's good to see some people are pretty familiar. So for those of you who are at the high end of knowledge, the next couple of minutes may be a bit of a refresher. And for those of you who for this is all new, this will be a bit of an introduction to us. So tip 6 really is to contact us. And we're here to help you if you've gone through tips 1 to 5 and still feel like your complaint isn't being heard, or you don't have the results you think that are appropriate, then give us a call and we may be able to help. So what can we do? So we oversee local and public sector organizations. Some people refer to us and our colleagues across the country as watchdogs. So we make sure people who deliver public services are following their own rules, and when they don't, we try to make things right and to hold those public bodies to account. Because we're a watchdog type office, it's also important to stress we're not part of government. We're independent of government. Our office is an office of the Legislative Assembly directly, and that allows us to be impartial in the work that we do. We hear a wide range of complaints each and every day about issues that are from people who feel they've been treated unfairly, to questions about how you can resolve issues on your own. So with each complaint and question, we listen and determine how best we can help. We also investigate allegations of wrongdoing and reprisal brought forward by current and former public servants, provincial government employees. And that activity is known as whistleblowing. And finally, we share our expertise in promoting fairness through educational workshops and webinars, guides, and other resources with public sector organizations. And that helps those public bodies avoid unfairness in the first place. Important thing to know about us is that our services are free and they're confidential. What is important, what's very important is our jurisdiction, who we can investigate and who we can't investigate. We oversee a lot of different public organizations, over 1,000, in fact, in British Columbia. And our website now has a neat tool for you to help guide you called Complaint Checker that Lindsay's going to show you in a couple of minutes. And it gives specific information about the organizations we hear about most often, including whether we can or can't investigate. It also can help by giving you some information about where to go to raise concerns about those organizations. And there's a link just posted in the chat in case you want to check that out yourself. About half the complaints that we receive are about that hexagon in the upper left corner there, provincial government ministries. And so those would be very familiar to most of you, the government of British Columbia and its ministries. But that's not by any means all of the organizations that we can investigate. As you can see, there are many others. All the public schools in the province and all the school districts, all the local governments in the province, all the public universities and colleges in British Columbia, the agency boards and commissions. So by volume, probably the biggest in that category would be WorkSafe BC. All the hospitals and health authorities in the province. Crown corporations, sometimes people are a bit unfamiliar with what a crown corporation would be. It's a number of entities that are established as corporations that serve the public interest. And the biggest two by volume, by complaint volume for us would be BC Hydro and ICBC. ICBC is now actually, last year was our #1 public authority by complaint volume. So a whole manner of public bodies across the province. But it's not everything, and while our jurisdiction is broad, it doesn't cover all public bodies that you might encounter or all entities you might encounter. And probably the biggest exception that we receive complaints about that we can't investigate it would be the federal government. As you know, Canada is a federal state. Some powers are exercised provincially and others are exercised federally. And we're a provincial body, so our jurisdiction relates to things established under provincial law. And so if you have a concern about the federal government, that would be something that we can't investigate, although you can certainly call us and sometimes we're able to provide you with some good referral information because we've been doing this for 40 years. And so we have a pretty good network established of who can help you even at the federal government level. So this slide has a number of other sorts of things that we can investigate. Another one that's significant would be the police. And that's because there are specialized ombuds who can investigate concerns about either municipal police or the provincial police, which in British Columbia is the RCMP. You'll see on the right-hand side there, we don't investigate private disputes. That's because our job is to investigate public bodies. But sometimes those private disputes can involve a public body. So if someone has a concern about a private physician, for example, in private practice, they may be complaining to that physician's regulatory body, the College of Physicians and Surgeons, or a lawyer, that the regulatory body being the Law Society. Or someone has a dispute, a landlord has a dispute with a tenant, and they go to the residential tenancy board, and then they're unhappy with how the residential tenancies branch has dealt with their concerns. Or a worker feels that they've been unhappy with their employer, say they didn't get a paycheck when they left that place of employment. They make a complaint to the Employment Standards Branch, which is part of the Provincial Ministry of Labor. And thus we could be involved. So even on those private disputes, there may be a public body that's involved, but we don't get involved in purely private disputes. So it's important to know that our jurisdiction, while very broad, does have some limits. But if you're ever in doubt and you're not sure, always call us and we can help with that. So that piece of jurisdiction is very important to us. And you may have questions. And as I said, there's lots of information, and Lindsay's going to show you a complaint checker, which is a way of checking that. But also you can always call us whenever you're in doubt. So to give you a sense of what our work actually looks like in practice, I'm going to share a couple of examples of matters that were investigated by our office. So the first one is a complaint. I mentioned BC Hydro a moment ago, and this is a complaint about BC Hydro. So it provides an example of how our investigations can lead to broader changes. So sometimes policies can be applied more strictly than they need to be, and then that can lead to unfairness. So in this case, a person who we'll call Jeremy contacted us because he felt that he was being treated unfairly by BC Hydro. He had disputed his high electricity bills with Hydro for months, and he was refusing to pay his bill until the issue was resolved. BC Hydro then disconnected his service because his account was in arrears. Jeremy wanted a test of his electrical meter because he was concerned it wasn't accurate, but BC Hydro wouldn't agree to test it because his account was in arrears. So Jeremy called us for help, and we reached out to BC Hydro because of their policy of not performing meter tests when an account was in arrears. Appeared to us to be stricter than the relevant section of something called the electric tariff, which governs Hydro's relationship with its customers. And in response, BC Hydro agreed to modify its policy and allow meter testing for customers disconnected for non-payment. And BC Hydro also offered to apologize to Jeremy for providing him with inaccurate information regarding his eligibility for meter testing, and advised that they would contact him to have his meter tested. Another example was we had a case come to our office where the government ministry responsible for providing income assistance was operating under a policy that resulted in over 3,000 ministry clients receiving less income assistance than they were legally entitled to. We issued a public report about this case called Working Within the Rules, which you can find on our website. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. We received a complaint from a person who we'll call Mrs. Smith, and she was only able to work casually due to her disability. And she was entitled to what's known as an earnings exemption. And that earnings exemption is designed to encourage income assistance recipients to work to the degree that they're able by allowing them to keep limited amounts of earned income over and above their monthly assistance payments. The problem in this case was that Ms. Smith's earning pattern was quite variable, and when she earned a bit more under ministry policy, she was not eligible for the earnings exemption for a future month. But that wasn't consistent with the regulation that governed the earnings exemption and applied to her circumstances. And this resulted in Ms. Smith receiving less income assistance than she was legally entitled to under the regulation. So this happened to her a few times. And each time the matter was addressed through the ministry's own reconsideration process. And each time she requested reconsideration, the regulation was applied correctly and she'd be granted her earnings exemption. However, the ministry didn't change its policy and continued to apply it to her and to everybody else in her situation. So we brought this matter to the attention of the ministry and asked whether this had happened to other people. And the answer was yes, 3,000 other people. So following our investigation, I was pleased that the ministry accepted our recommendations to address the issue by changing their policy so it conformed with the regulation and agreeing to reimburse not just Ms. Smith, but all 3,000 of those who had received less assistance than they were eligible for. And in this case, that totaled about over $600,000. So that was important and established an important principle. But both of those cases are good examples of how one person's complaint can benefit others, and we're always watchful for that potential. Sometimes a complaint is just one person, but sometimes it's many people. And that takes me to just a very brief discussion of our systemic investigations. These are initiated, unlike most of our investigations, which are initiated by a complaint, these are initiated on our own motion. They generally are of wider impact, and they allow for a broad consideration of policies and procedures into matters of public interest. We've, as you can see from this slide, issued a range of reports covering a wide range of public services over the past many years. And we monitor, when we issue these public reports, we monitor government's implementation to make sure that if they promise to implement our recommendations, that they actually live up to those public commitments. I'm going to now turn things over to Lindsay, who's going to show you that complaint checker that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And that complaint checker is really designed to help you understand whether your complaint is something that you can bring to us. Lindsay?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Great. So yeah, as we mentioned earlier, we usually will ask members of the public to do their best to try to resolve their concerns through that specific organization's complaint process before they end up coming to us. And that's because in our experience, and we have over 40 years of experience doing this, complaints can be handled much more efficiently and effectively when dealing directly with that organization involved. But we realized that not knowing where to go is actually a barrier to make a complaint. And that's why we built an online tool to help you, members of the public, to figure out where to take those complaints. So when you visit our website here, we've got, you can see it right here. When you visit our website, you'll notice that we have this great resource, and it's called the Complaint Checker. This tool is available online, so it's 24/7, and it gives you information about where you can take your complaints before you end up coming to us. It also provides specific information about the organizations that we hear about more often, including whether we can or can't investigate. So we're going to just walk through a quick demo here. So let's say that you have a complaint about WorkSafe BC. You can go to the complaint checker and look under Crown Corporations, and then you can find WorkSafe listed there. So you just click on that, and you'll see some of the options listed about how you can raise your concerns about WorkSafe, including taking it to the review division, possibly the Workers' Compensation Appeal Tribunal or advisor's office, depending on the nature of your concerns. You'll see all of the contact information listed there to help get you to the right place for your complaint. So let's quickly do another one here. Maybe you have a complaint about a lawyer, and as Jay mentioned, we can't actually investigate specific complaints about individual lawyers. Those are those private kind of disputes. That's actually the job of the Law Society of BC. But we do have jurisdiction to investigate concerns about how the Law Society handled your complaint. So here on the complaint checker, you can see the Law Society listed. And the first step may be requesting a review by something called the Complaints Review Committee. So here we go. We're in the Law Society. Thanks. And if you're not satisfied with how the Law Society handled your complaint, then you can contact us and submit a complaint to our office. So even when an organization actually isn't one that we oversee or isn't part of our jurisdiction, we still do make every effort to connect people to the best complaint avenue. So let's do a non-jurisdictional complaint, so one that we actually don't have jurisdiction over. Let's say that your complaint's about a private insurance company. So you can access information on our complaint checker about the organizations that actually do handle these complaints, including the Ombud Service for Life and Health Insurance and the General Insurance Ombud Service. There you go. You can find more information there. It's a really cool, handy tool that you can use. And we did pop that in the chat earlier. So that was that second link that was provided to you. It's also on our homepage as well. So that gives you an idea of how the complaint checker works to help you find the right place to report your concerns. All right. We'll just do a bit of a summary now. Here we go. All right, so yeah, sorry, before the summary, actually, we showed you those two examples on the complaint checker, but we do want to highlight some of the other key complaint avenues that we see a lot in our work. Here are the most common referrals our office makes to organizations that we do oversee. So if you have a complaint related to the healthcare system, you can contact the patient care quality office in your health region. They have a well-established complaints process, and all information is available on their website. So local government, it will depend on the size of your city or your community, and it's important to check their website for the complaint processes, and you can always contact the chief administrative officer if you're not able to determine who to connect with specifically. Provincial government ministries, and complaints are generally handled by the government ministry, the specific government ministry. So knowing which ministry that program or service falls under is helpful, and most have an internal complaints process. ICBC, they've got a customer relations office, so fair practices office. And then BC Hydro, they've got a customer service and complaints supervisor. So they have their own specific complaints process. If you've tried all these avenues and you still don't feel like you're getting the answers that you deserve, then we invite you to contact us. So now, sorry, I jumped to the summary a little bit early. Now we're at the summary, and we've covered some tips for raising complaints. And I hope that these were easy and tangible and usable ideas for you, for getting your concerns raised and listened to. Again, the goal in raising complaints really is about having your concern addressed and making it easier for others in the future by having that organization address something that they might be doing that isn't fair. Let's do a really quick review of the tips. So the first one, define the problem and be clear on what needs to be done to fix it. Do your research on the complaints process that you need to go through. Share your complaint and ask for a response. Keep notes and records throughout that process. Ask about any further appeal or review processes available within the organization. And then remember that final tip, you can always contact the BC Ombudsperson if you're not able to resolve your complaint with the organization directly. We do hope that these tips will help you in raising your concerns. Organizations will only do better if they receive feedback from the folks that they're serving. And so thank you very much for being with us to learn some of those tips, for being with us today. And I'm now going to pass it back over to Jay and Rachel, who will answer a couple questions.
Hey, thanks very much, Lindsay. Those are great tips. And we've had some great questions come in, Jay. Many of them have been answered directly, but a few we've left for us to discuss here. So first question is, how do you deal with a conflict of interest where a person is maybe reviewing their own decision and the complaint is about that person or the decision was made by that person?
Right. So conflict of interest is an interesting area, and it actually covers a whole lot of different sorts of issues. Conflict of interest in its classic sense means someone who has a personal interest that conflicts with their public duty. And so that's one kind of conflict of interest. But what you're raising, Rachel, is probably what sometimes people call a conflict of interest, which is someone who has made a decision and then there's a review and they're being asked, to review that decision. And some people describe that as a conflict of interest. And if that complaint handling guide that was in the chat earlier today is a good example of what the advice we've given to public bodies, which is when you're having a review or appeal process, what our general advice to public bodies is you should have someone not involved in the original decision conduct the review and make that review or appeal decision. Even though it's an internal process sometimes, it's important that it be someone new who can bring fresh eyes and fresh consideration so that it is and is seen to be a full and robust appeal. So that's what we say to public bodies, and I'm pleased that many of them, most public bodies these days, do have better appeal processes than they used to have in the past. But it's a work in progress and something we continue to work on with public bodies.
Okay, great. Yeah, so having that little bit of independence in conducting the review over the original decision maker is important. So thank you for your question. Another question, you said that we had received quite a number of complaints during the pandemic, COVID-related complaints. Can you tell us a little bit about what people are complaining about to our office related to COVID?
Absolutely, and probably the thing to remember is, as we address this, is we have jurisdiction over 1,000 public bodies across the province. As I mentioned before, from provincial government ministries and local governments to crown corporations and health authorities and school districts and post-secondary institutions. And virtually every one of them has changed their services one way or the other during the pandemic. And so, as you can imagine, in those 600, we're receiving quite a range of complaints. They're not all about one thing. So we're hearing about issues that, some of those issues are things that all of us are seeing in the news as well. But we're also seeing things that maybe people are less familiar with. We've heard from inmates in correctional facilities who have safety concerns are due to COVID. We've received complaints from a number of complaints about seniors issues, about visitation policies in long-term care, availability of PPE and quality of care in long-term care. We've been hearing from parents who have concerns about practices and protocols in the school system. We've heard from people who have concerns about ICBC in relation to COVID, for example, delays in road tests that have resulted from changes related to the pandemic, from people who are seeking fee refunds from government, sometimes because of pandemic-induced changes, plans change because of the pandemic, or a service is only available in a different way, and so someone who paid a fee now wants to be refunded. So a whole range of complaints, and also complaints to local governments. So as you can imagine, the list is as varied as our jurisdiction. I guess one thing that makes some sense, but maybe is a bit of a surprise to us, is we've actually seen a reduction in the number of complaints in certain areas. One example would be complaints regarding the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction, which used to be until this past year our number one public authority by volume, and complaints about that ministry relate to income assistance and disability assistance, both applicants and recipients. We, as I said, we normally see a pretty high level, but during the pandemic, government actually had a deepened focus on supporting individuals who were receiving income assistance, and income assistance rates increased during the pandemic, and that addressed a number of the concerns that we normally hear about. So we saw a reduction. So that's something that's a bit unusual for us. We're monitoring carefully and watching for an uptick in complaints as some of those temporary pandemic-related supports are reduced or withdrawn. And we're going to be watching that not just at that ministry, but obviously as public service changes, as public service changes again, as we hopefully reach the end of the pandemic. And so we'll be looking across the board at what those changes look like.
Wonderful. Okay. Thanks, Jay. I think we have time for maybe just one more question. And the question was, how do you choose systemic investigations? We had talked about some of our systemic investigations coming from one complaint and given some examples of systemics. How do we choose topics that are good for systemic investigation?
That's a great question, and one that is very important to us, because Most of our work is related to complaints that arise from individual complaints, but a few times a year we do initiate an investigation on our own motion. And generally, as I mentioned before, that's related to a broader issue of fairness, allows us to take a broader look at a particular sector. And we want to make sure that it's an issue that affects a lot of people. So sometimes those come forward because we're receiving a lot of complaints about an area, and if we're seeing an increase, for example, in an area, that's going to cause us to take a look at it. But other times, it's almost because we're not receiving complaints, and because there are barriers to receiving complaints, that we want to make sure that we're looking under every rock to make sure that there isn't unfairness occurring in an area that we're not hearing about. So we have to be observant and knowledgeable about public services, even if we're not receiving complaints. So we do that as well. And over the years, we've conducted a wide range of systemic complaints, ranging from seniors care to delayed social assistance appeals, to failure to conduct prison inspections, to integrity controls on lottery ticket sales. So really any area of public administration can result in a systemic investigation. And it's something that we take a lot of pride in the work that we do in that area, because we know that those have the potential to affect a number of people.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of our time together. Lindsay has put our contact information back up on the screen there. If you have any questions we haven't answered today, you can email the questions to info@bcombudsperson.ca. We will leave the Q&A open for a few minutes as we close off here today, but we are available for further questions as you have them. Again, we thank you very, very much for taking the time out of your day to spend with us. We hope our tips have been helpful for you today. Our office has a number of resources that are available on our website, so please do check that out. We try and provide a lot of support to government to deliver their services fairly through our resources and webinars and education offerings. So please check those out as well. And thank you for spending the last hour with us. And our recording of this webinar will be on our website as well. So I think that it brings us to the end, Jay. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Bye.